What about active record? Those of you with experience beyond PHP for web programming, where do you see this a lot? Oh, I think I heard it.
Basically, it's a way to access the database without doing sort of like manual queries. So,
OK, good.
Basically, it's sort of like a wrapper around what your database model is, and it gives you a bunch of very convenient methods for interacting with it.
OK.
And depending on what your database is, it could be very different. It's not like you're actually messing with the database. It's
OK.
The interface for interacting.
OK, good. So let me oversimplify. So active record is a means of interacting with the database and reading and writing records, let's call them, or rows more concretely in a relational database, but without writing a lot of those queries yourself. Right? A lot of the queries you type for any SQL things actually follow this silly paradigm, CRUD, create, read, update, delete. This maps roughly to insert, select, update, and delete. But CRUD apparently sounded better. And there's different ways that communicate this exact same acronym, but it's a very common model, especially in relational databases where there's really only 4 primary operations, the 4 CRUD operations. And so throughout your code, both for Project 0 and maybe even past projects you've worked on, you probably did issue a lot of selects and a lot of inserts and a lot of deletes. And certainly in a project like Project 0, if you have things like a course and an instructor and a location, any of these real world entities, you might be copying a lot of the same code that differs only in terms of like the table name, maybe only in terms of the field name. So there's a lot of structural redundancy there. So active record is meant to abstract away a lot of those uninteresting operations for adding a record, deleting a record, updating a record, and just give you a class-based interface for doing those very common operations without ever actually touching SQL. Let me actually fast forward to a concrete example. In the active record model, and this is some PHP pseudocode, but it's actually syntactically correct. In active record, if you want to insert a new course into your database, you don't use the insert query for SQL. You instead create a new object, which in this case is called course. So capital C course. This, again, for those unfamiliar, when defining classes, and CodeIgniter messes this up a little bit, sometimes the class name should be capital C. This is the invocation of what's called the constructor, which is a method that is automatically invoked whenever you instantiate an object, create an object for the first time, that can, if you want, take arguments. But I've just chosen not to give it any arguments here. And the new keyword means actually allocate memory on the heap for this new object. All right, so this gives me essentially the empty container that is a course, but there's nothing inside of it. So how do I put stuff inside of it? Well, let me put a cat num of like 7295. And let me put a title of, oops, I'm missing a $sign. So I guess it is pseudocode. Now it's actually code. All right, so now I'm putting in the title of the course here, and then this is the magic or the abstraction that active record gives you. You just say save. And what the save method does, which was implemented maybe by you, but more likely by the framework that is automatically generating the requisite code for you, this will now create the equivalent of something like this SQL query without you having to care about the specifics. It will do something like insert into courses, something like catnum, title, and then values, 7295, comma, mobile, ... So it will induce that query for you. And similarly, can you update fields or delete records and the like? So this is active record.
Is there any advantage to like hard writing actual SQL queries as opposed to using active record?
Good question. Is there any advantage to actually writing the queries yourself? Short answer is it depends. For very simple queries like this, not really. And one of the reasons for the popularization of this active record model, especially in the Ruby on Rails community, is just it's so damn easy to do things quickly. You could whip up your own core shopping tool potentially much faster if you don't have to think about a lot of the queries and the database design and the like. But what you give up, arguably, is a lot of control. And if you're actually trying to really give a lot of thought to your schema design, to primary keys, foreign keys, and you know what the real world implications are for performance on doing selects in certain ways or doing joins in certain ways, you might not want to save your time by using this model at the expense of performance potentially. But again, for relatively simple websites where you're talking hundreds, thousands of users, and it's much more important to ship the thing within a week and move on to something else, these models can really help. Now, CodeIgniter does not really provide this model. In fact, they have a horrific, I think, implementation of this, whereby you actually use, for instance, your model class, which itself has a whole bunch of methods, like get courses, and then you use this arrow. Actually, let's see if we can, let me see if I can find the documentation in question so I can rant slightly for just a moment. CodeIgniter model. Let's see if it's this one. Yeah, so this. So I think this is horrific. So this is their, what's class, this class? And you can get the counterpoint, I'm sure, in section this week when Tommy is instead on the soapbox instead of me. So this is their blog model that extends CodeIgniter model. So you probably did something like this for your course or courses model thus far for the project. But then you have apparently these things here, which we'll talk a little bit, we'll see something like this in a little bit, where these are essentially public data members inside of this class. And then you have this construct method, which this is, for now, I'm going to wave my hand at. And then you have these things. So this method here, get last 10 entries, this method, based on its name and what it's actually doing, is actually consistent with this pattern data access objects, DAO. And we'll see this more concretely with our own code outside of the CodeIgniter framework. So this is actually pretty clean, right? Because then you would say this, arrow course, arrow get last 10 entries. And for me, I would call it courses, but the idea, or blog in this case, so this, the takeaway is the same. You have this sort of generic class called blog model, and you have this helper method inside of it that gets you something related to the blog. But then where they start blurring things in the interest of keeping things simple, is then they do something like this, where similarly can use this exact same class and store inside of this particular instance of the class a whole bunch of fields like title and content and date. And then you can call this db insert to insert yourself, the current model object, into the database. So this is very much like a blurring of these lines. Like it's both trying to do active record and it's also trying to do DAO, but it's just conceptually mixing metaphors, I think. Either the class should do things like your helper methods and talk to the database and get you blog entries or get you courses, or it should model some real world entity like the blog entry. This model here is trying to do both. Now on the flip side, learning CodeIgniter and actually making something with it is actually relatively fast compared to a lot of the more sophisticated alternatives. And I'll rattle off a few later today, but you'll be invited to use any framework or none at all for Project 1, but just realize that the learning curve tends to be higher even if the implementation tends to be cleaner. So these are just tensions. There is rarely will you find any framework in life that you love. You're almost always going to hate it for some reason. And this is one of my pet peeves here.
Is that any PHP framework?
What's that? Yes, so it still has to be, like, we'd rather you not go off and implement things in Python or Ruby, just because it's useful on scale for us to at least use the same languages. But in terms of frameworks, we won't care for Project 1. All right, so let's come back to this. So there's one sort of additional soapbox thing that I can say here. I personally have never liked this model, though I definitely see the utility of being able to do things so relatively easy. It's never kind of rubbed me the right way that I can create essentially an empty course object, which is called a course, but doesn't really represent a course yet. And then I have to manually put inside of it the requisite fields. And now this is actually a course that I can save to my database. To me, it's just a little messy if the approach you take is to sort of manually insert things in this way. Now, we'll see, especially in Objective-C, better use of constructors. So I actually would like this a little more, where you actually do something like 7295 mobile ... So this is, for those unfamiliar, an example of an explicit constructor that actually takes arguments. And in this model, when you create this empty container on the heap, because I've passed in arguments this time, now those arguments should be automatically put inside of the object. And for those unfamiliar, and we'll see an example of this today, if I wanted to implement this course method, let me just go ahead and put this in context so that this is indeed not just all pseudocode. If I had something like class course in PHP, what I can do here is public function __ construct. In PHP, anytime you have a double underscore, it means it's a special function reserved by the PHP folks, so you better not name your own methods with those names. Then I'm going to do something like catnum and title, and then I'm going to go in here, and what I could do then is upon being invoked, I can say this catnum gets title, or no, that's be stupid, gets catnum, And then down here, I can do something the same. And PHP, frankly, is a little lazy, so it's by no means a perfect or beautiful language all the time. Just because I've simply said this catnum and this title, those properties, even though they're not explicitly defined, will automatically now exist inside of the objects, which is a little sloppy design. So if I really want to be more rigorous, I can use the var keyword, but that's actually a little retro now. What I would instead do is something like public catnum. And then I would say something like public title. Now, even this, and we'll come back to this, this is not perfect. Now, this is explicitly telling the world a course has a catalog number and a title. And that's a good thing, especially in the context of working with a partner or writing open source software that other people are going to read. Now you're sort of engaging in a contract, so to speak, with other developers or with the readers of your code, whereby you're committing to those fields now existing.